You expect Alexandria to be all marble and monuments, the polished face of an ancient metropolis everyone has already memorized from schoolbooks and glossy travel pages. The library lost to fire, the lighthouse carving the horizon, kings and queens posing for coin portraits. But if you come down to the shoreline at dawn, when the light is still soft and gulls stitch silver patterns over the water, something else insists on being seen. The sea keeps secrets that the city above has forgotten. We like tidy endings for famous places. We want a closed ledger. Yet there is a stretch of shallow seabed off Alexandria that refuses to fit into any neat narrative, a place where timbers and stones and the occasional glint of bronze whisper of a harbor that once hummed with life, and where new underwater evidence is beginning to redraw the map of Cleopatra's Alexandria, not the monumental postcard we think we know, but a living, messy, contested city with a lost harbor stitched to its name. Imagine for a moment the shock of finding a wharf where none was supposed to be, of pulling up pottery sherds in a place modern maps label merely as open water. Picture the tug of a magnetometer reading that insists something solid lies beneath the silt. Hear the radio chatter of divers exchanging the kind of excited, careful sentences archaeologists memorize. "We have an anomaly, bring the corer, hold, that's a coin." These are not the theatrical pronouncements of a sensational documentary. They're the patient notes of people who have spent their lives listening to the past impose itself on the present. And what they are finding off Alexandria's coasts, new sonar traces, submerged quays, collapsed column drums, amphorae in neat rows, asks a question that sounds almost ludicrous until you feel the weight of it. Could we be standing on the margins of Cleopatra's port, the commercial artery that ferried goods, ideas, and power to a queen whose name still sparks imaginations? We promise big revelations because the evidence is big enough to warrant them. Architectural fragments consistent with Hellenistic construction, ship timbers datable to the last centuries before the Common Era, and artifacts that speak of a vibrant, tangled economy, oil amphorae, imported fineware, fish salting vats, and a scatter of coins and jewelry. Yet these finds are also threaded with contradictions. Radiocarbon dates ripple like uncertain waves. The seabed has shuffled straighter the way a gambler shuffles a deck. Later construction, medieval reuse, and natural coastal change have all conspired to scramble a clean story. So we must hold two moods at once: the thrill of potential discovery and the patient skepticism of the field scientist. We will follow both instincts because the best story here is not simply a triumphal identification of a harbor, but the slow, often ambivalent process by which the past reveals itself. I want you to come with me into this ambiguity. We will travel through sound and time, the hum of the ocean, the tinny beep of survey gear, a diver's breath like a metronome marking the minutes, and then cut to the imagined bustle of a dock in Cleopatra's day, sailors barking orders, camels sleeping with bellies full of grain, merchants bargaining over purple dye from Tyre. Along the way we will meet stubborn anomalies in the data and daring hypotheses from scholars who know how to argue with evidence. Some will say the site is part of a Ptolemaic harbor complex, intimately tied to Cleopatra's policies and the cosmopolitan economy she inherited. Others will argue for a later, Roman phase construction or even for a natural landscape misinterpreted by modern instruments. There will be voices that insist on myth, that the harbor was cursed, or that it was the scene of royal flight and betrayal, and voices that insist on the humbler, harder truth: urban life is rarely tidy, and things sink for reasons both political and environmental. The place where land and sea meet is a zone of exchange, of goods, of people, of power, and also of forgetting. Coastal cities remake themselves constantly. Events that seem cataclysmic in one century become ordinary sediment in the next. Alexandria has been rebuilt repeatedly. Earthquakes have rearranged its shoreline, sea level changes have lapped at its foundations, and ancient engineers altered the coastline intentionally to suit new harbors and fortifications. That makes underwater archaeology a kind of forensic art. You comb through layers that are not always linear, interpret items displaced by currents or human hands, and always keep in mind the possibility of misreading the tangle. And yet, when an amphora comes up intact with its maker's mark visible, or when a submerged column drum fits a sequence known from Ptolemaic architecture, the silence breaks into something that reads like speech. There are other reasons this is more than an antiquarian curiosity. This harbor, if it existed in the terms the finds suggest, would have been a conduit for political theater. Cleopatra VII was not merely a queen who sat on marble and issued decrees. She cultivated image and spectacle, moved fleets and negotiated alliances, and used the maritime world as much as she used palace corridors. The control of harbors, of sea lanes, of grain shipments, these were the levers of power in the eastern Mediterranean. To find a lost harbor linked to her court is to glimpse the infrastructure of influence, how naval capacity enabled diplomacy, how commercial ties undergirded political favor, how a queen's portrait circulating on coinage had economic life attached to it. It would also force us to reckon with daily life, the fishermen, dockworkers, sailors, craftsmen, and slaves whose rhythms the grand histories tend to miss. In the echo of their amphory is a chorus we rarely hear, and that chorus matters. But here's where it gets tricky. The coastline around Alexandria has shifted dramatically since the first Ptolemies crowned their city. Ancient geographers wrote of islands, canals, and lagoons in the area. Later writers recorded floods and silting. Modern engineers in the 19th and 20th centuries dug and built, and sometimes accidentally buried older features. A single location can therefore have layers of engagement: a pharaonic shore, a Hellenistic dock, a Roman mole, a Byzantine fishery, a medieval harbor, and then modern industrial fill. Disentangling that palimpsest requires not only sonar and coring but also careful reading of ancient texts, numismatic evidence, and comparative architecture. When you add to that the human tendency to project the dramatic, to want this harbor to be Cleopatra's harbor because that's a neat headline, you must be scrupulous. The evidence must be coaxed into a narrative that allows for uncertainty without collapsing into sensationalism. Still, for all the caution, there is room for mythic imagination here. The Mediterranean has always been a stage for travelers and storytellers. It is where voyagers met strangers and stories metastasized into legends. Think of lost tribes said to have sailed from the Black Sea into the Nile estuary, of giant skeletons claimed by local fishermen and whispered about in taverns, of cursed stones that supposedly bring misfortune to anyone who disturbs them. Those elements, whether they are products of folk imagination or misinterpretations of unusual finds, become part of the archaeological texture. They tell us about how people have always tried to fill gaps in knowledge with narrative, to give shape to anxiety about the sea's appetite for human structures. We will treat these tales respectfully, as data not of the past event itself, but of the human reactions that have a history all their own. Now, let's be fair, the idea of a single harbor, owned by Cleopatra, is a simplification. Harbors are systems, networks rather than solitary nodes. They are made up of quays, warehouses, slipways, canals, and the people who keep them functioning. If this site is indeed a harbor used in the Ptolemaic era, it may have served multiple rulers and undergone many modifications. Cleopatra's name sticks to it because her reign is one of the most dramatic moments of Alexandria's long life, and because she represents a point at which local dynastic politics intersected with Roman imperial ambition. But we must not let that resonance drown the finer particulars. The way local pottery styles tell us about regional trade, the way residue analysis can reveal what jars contained, the way wood species used in ship timbers can tell us where those ships came from. Each small fact is an instrument in reconstructing a larger soundscape. Picture yourself walking that foggy shore at dawn, the taste of salt in the air and a few weathered stones underfoot that older villagers say have always been there. Imagine stepping into a small boat, feeling the engine thrum beneath you as you are ferried over a dark patch of water that, at low tide, seems unremarkable. Now imagine the sudden lift. A diver emerges with a shard of painted pottery, its glaze dim but readable to an experienced eye, like a voice returning from under the waves. That image, human, intimate, and slightly uncanny, is what makes this story matters. Archaeology is a humanist pursuit, and its treasures are not only objects, but the human lives they represent. We will proceed with rigor and awe in equal measure. We will examine the artifacts and the acoustics of the data, the histories and the myths, the conflicting interpretations and the stubborn facts that refuse to be neatly packaged. Above all, we will keep asking, what does this tell us about the ancient world's connectivity, about how power and commerce flowed through the Mediterranean, and about the way a single queen's reputation can shadow a coastline for 2 millennia. We still don't know, but that is the point. The mystery is not a failure of knowledge, it is an invitation to keep looking, to ask better questions, and to accept that some answers arrive slowly, like ships whose masts first appear as faint lines on the horizon before they anchor and unload their stories. The first site we'll walk into together is a shallow, silted shelf a few hundred meters off the modern Corniche, where the echo of a sonar pulse first revealed a long, low line of anomalies that looked for all the world like a row of keys. Imagine a ghostly jetty sketched in black and white on a screen, the kind of thing that makes seasoned surveyors sit up and say, "Now that's interesting," and then go quiet. This place, call it the southern quay of the Lost Harbor, lying where ancient mariners once met the Nile's canopic branch and where land once jutted into the sea, presents an elegant one-sentence teaser. A submerged quay, aligned with Hellenistic masonry, hints at a public harbor used in the late Ptolemaic period for trade and ritual. The historical context here matters and is precise. Cleopatra VII Philopator lived from 69 to 30 BC and reigned from 51 BC until her suicide in 30 BC. Her Alexandria was the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, a Hellenistic state born of Alexander's generals in the late 4th century BC and sustained through centuries of syncretic culture. In measurable terms, the features mapped by multibeam echo sounders stretch roughly 150 to 200 meters along a west-southwest axis, with apparent masonry blocks up to 2 meters across and interstices suggesting slipways or boat landing ramps. Sediment cores taken nearby show a compact, human-made deposit layer at depths between 1.2 and 2.5 meters below current mean sea level. And radiocarbon samples from charred timber and shelled deposits give calibrated dates. Clustering in the last 2 centuries BC and the early 1st century CE, right at the cusp of Cleopatra's rule and the Roman annexation. The cultural scale is enormous. This is not a fisher's jetty but a structured space that would have handled amphorae by the hundreds, served war galleys and merchantmen, and hosted the ritual comings and goings that linked the palace with the sea. Key discoveries at the site include not only the mapped masonry but also concentrations of amphorae, types consistent with oil and wine containers from the Aegean and the Levant, rows of sunken wooden stakes interpreted by some as part of a quayside reinforcement, fragments of painted plaster that might have been architectural surfacing. A scatter of coins including a handful of Ptolemaic tetradrachms and Roman denarii, and biological residues in pottery that point to fish salting in garum production. There are also more uncanny finds, a cluster of lead anchors of a type plausibly dated to the late Hellenistic period, a partly collapsed column drum that could once have been part of a colonnaded quay front, and, found by a diver probing the silt, a bronze fibula with inlaid glass that still held hints of purple dye in its crevices. An intimate object that throws a human light onto the trade routes and fashion of the harbor's users. All of this is the sort of material culture that invites multiple competing theories. One camp argues, based on the architectural alignment, the amphora types, and the coinage, that this was a Ptolemaic state-run harbor annexed to Alexandria's official quay system and used for crown-controlled grain shipments and royal fleet maneuvers. They point out that Cleopatra's diplomacy depended on control of naval access, and that a private or semi-public quay of this size would have been a strategic asset in the late Hellenistic power play against Rome. Another team, cautious about the stratigraphic disturbances and the mixture of pottery styles, suggests that what we see is a palimpsest, older Ptolemaic foundations repurposed by Roman engineers who added masonry and reused blocks, meaning the visible harbor architecture may reflect a Roman rebuilding of a modest Hellenistic waterfront. Still another interpretation, favored by geomorphologists and some coastal historians, reads the anomalies less as intentional keys and more as the remains of breakwaters and natural shoal ridges enhanced by light human work. A hybrid natural-artificial interface typical of estuarine engineering where locals adjusted to changing currents without building monumental keys. Now, let's be fair, each theory has merits and each raises questions. The Ptolemaic hypothesis aligns neatly with certain historical narratives about royal maritime control, but it depends on linking the timbers and the amphorae to a very specific window in time. The Roman reuse hypothesis explains mixed material culture but struggles with the scale of the masonry blocks, which look Hellenistic in their tooling and dimensions. The geomorphic reading accounts for natural processes but has difficulty explaining the neatness of some engineered features and the presence of costly decorative plaster fragments, which suggest at least some intention to display or beautify the waterfront. But here's where it gets tricky. Coastal stratigraphy in Alexandria is notoriously complex, and human action, digging canals, building more works, even deliberate reclamation, has repeatedly rearranged the sedimentary record. A medieval land reclamation, a nearby Ottoman-era embankment, or the sheer weight of centuries of urban debris could easily have shelved older structures into different layers. Taphonomy, the science of how things decay and move, warns us not to read an unmixed sequence into a noisy dataset. Still, for all the evidence, the site insists on a particular mythic overlay that villagers and divers cannot resist. Stories persist of a Queen's Quay, where, local lore insists, purple dyes were traded and where, on some fog-bound night, a royal bark ran aground and a royal treasure sank. Fishermen tell tales, sometimes with a laugh, of giant bones snagged on nets, of alabaster chests that clang deep beneath the silt, and of an old stone that is said to curse anyone who disturbs it. These are the kinds of tales that professional archaeologists often treat with a raised eyebrow, but they are vital data for the cultural history of the place. They tell us how memory and imagination have layered themselves over material loss. Now imagine yourself standing on that modern corniche, the city's traffic a distant murmur, and then stepping into a small research launch that plies the shallow bay. Picture the sonar technician pointing at a glowing screen, a diver hooking the lifting sling to a battered amphora, and the sudden, private moment when an object appears in the daylight for the first time in 2,000 years, salt crusts flaking, a smear of ancient oil still telling its chemical story. Picture yourself wading knee-deep at low tide, lifting a flat stone that smells faintly of brine and fish, and feeling the vibration of centuries in your palms. That invitation to imagine is more than a rhetorical flourish, it is central to archaeological empathy, the practice of trying to put oneself inside a sequence of human actions, loading amphorae, shouting across a quay, measuring out rations of grain, so the dry data become lived experience. Yet even as we imagine, we must also reflect. This harbor, whatever its exact chronological place, reminds us of the infrastructural nature of power. Kings and queens depend on wharves and warehouses, not merely banners and decrees. A fleet needs a slipway as much as a strategy. The finds we've described, anchors, amphorae, coins, are the tangible instruments of that infrastructure. Finally, despite the seductive neatness of a single narrative, we arrive at the stubborn sentence every good scientist must be willing to say: we still don't know whether this quay was built by the crown specifically for royal purposes, whether it served the wider mercantile class of Alexandria in a more commercial capacity, or whether it is a hybrid of many uses that changed over centuries. We still don't know, and that uncertainty is not defeat but the engine that keeps excavation, and our curiosity, going. A few kilometers farther along the ancient shoreline, where the seabed widens into a fan of mud and broken ceramics, surveyors found what looked like a slow museum of boats, a scattered ship cemetery where whole timbers lay half-swallowed by silt and orientations that suggested not a single catastrophe but a series of losses piled up across generations. The one-sentence teaser for this reach is simple and cinematic. A graveyard of ships, their ribs split and oared benches collapsed, suggests repeated maritime disaster or deliberate sinking, each possibility telling a different story about Alexandria's relationship with the sea. Historically, this sector sits where the canopic branch of the Nile once fanned its waters out to the Mediterranean. Ancient shipping lanes threaded between shoals and islands here, and classical sources speak of storms and tides that could strand even the most seasoned helmsman. Measurably, sonar and sub-bottom profiler lines show timbers at intervals across a distance of about 300 meters, with the largest wrecks reaching hull lengths inferred at between 18 and 25 meters. Dimensions that match medium-sized merchantmen and coastal grain carriers of the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. Radiocarbon samples from associated charcoal and marine incrustation yield calibrated ranges that cluster broadly from the 3rd century BC through the 1st century CE, overlapping the Ptolemaic dynasty and the turbulent years of Cleopatra's reign. Dendroanalysis of a few well-preserved timbers points to wood harvested from eastern Mediterranean pines and mixed Anatolian oaks, which tells us these were not purely local craft but part of a regional fleet network. Key discoveries here include the expected amphory, many bearing stamps or punctate handles consistent with Levantine and Aegean origin, bundles of braided rope, a strikingly intact wooden rudder arm with traces of pitch, a handful of bronze nails in situ, and domestic items, an overturned oil lamp, a child-sized ceramic cup, and a bronze gaming piece that still wore the patina of long use. But the cemetery also yields puzzles. One wreck contained a cache of lead ingots stamped with a symbol no one has agreed upon. Another held a dozen small, carved ivory pieces packed carefully in a wooden chest, and in the silt between hulls were thousands of fish bones, an unusual concentration that has prompted speculation about smuggling, mass preservation of seafood, or the refuse of an itinerant fleet that processed fish on board. These artifacts prompt several competing theories. Some maritime archaeologists argue the assemblage represents the natural attrition of centuries of shipping in a hazard-prone estuary. Storms, shifting currents, and navigational error would gradually strand and sink ships, leaving a scatter that simply accumulated over time. Others read the pattern as evidence of deliberate scuttling or tactical sinking, vessels run aground and intentionally sunk to block channels during periods of political strife, a technique known from other late Hellenistic conflicts and plausible during the Roman civil wars that intersected with Cleopatra's politics. A third proposal, favored by economic historians, ties the cemetery to regulatory and economic cycles. During grinding winters or sieges, merchant fleets might have been immobilized, converted temporarily into shore-based processing sites, hence the fish bone concentrations, and some vessels later abandoned when fortunes shifted. Now, let's be fair, the scuttling hypothesis dovetails with certain textual reports of naval action around Alexandria in the 30s BC, but those accounts are themselves partisan and sometimes second-hand. The natural accumulation model fits the geological complexity of estuarine environments, but struggles to explain the presence of intentionally packed luxury goods, like the ivory cache, whose careful stowage suggests human agency rather than random wrecking. But here's where it gets tricky. The sea, over 2 millennia, is a master at confusing its own archive. Tidal flushes can move small objects, later anchoring mechanisms can drag and abrade timbers, and human reuse, fishermen cutting planks for warmth, later builders dragging away sound timbers, means that what remains visible is a highly edited version of what was lost. Still, for all the measured argument, local lore floods this place with spectacle. Fishermen tell of giant bones snagged on nets, stories that, when repeated in the hushed bars near the Corniche, often become tales of sailors' corpses so large they must have belonged to some ancient race of seafarers or to giant sea creatures that devoured ships whole. Divers sometimes report uncanny finds, a carved head of a deity with one eye gouged, which older villagers call an apotropaic object placed to ward off storms. An old woman swore she had seen a chest studded with gold washed close to the surface during a neap tide and that any who tried to claim it fell ill afterward. An oral curse that locals use to explain misfortune from storms to bad fishing seasons. Picture yourself, then, in a small dinghy bobbing over that ship's cemetery, the engine hum, the sudden hush as you cut it and lower a diver who disappears beneath rippling sunlight into a world where light becomes a slow, filtered rain. Imagine the diver's lamp carving through the silt and revealing a rudder arm with dried pitch still clinging to its notch, or the small, personal items that make ancient sailors suddenly feel like people you might know. That invitation to imagine is a methodological tool. Empathy helps archaeologists recognize domestic assemblages, but it can also seduce us into narratives that overreach the data. A reflective insight here is that ship cemeteries are less monuments to catastrophe than archives of ordinary maritime life. Loss and repair, the pragmatics of trade, the improvisations of sailors whose livelihoods depended on fragile hulls and fickle winds. We still don't know whether the cemetery is primarily the residue of storms, the footprint of wartime scuttling, or the remains of an economy that sometimes turned ships into factories and then into refuse. We still don't know. Beyond the ship cemetery, closer to an ancient channel whose traces show up faintly in the seabed mapping, there is a stretch of submerged structures that some team members have taken to calling the warehouse terraces, a cluster of low foundations and rectangular pits that suggest storage facilities arrayed in a grid-like plan parallel to an imagined dock line. The teaser is as precise as it is provocative, a series of storage terraces, with evidence of bulk handling and residue consistent with salted fish and preserved goods, hints at a maritime economy organized on an industrial scale in Cleopatra's coastal hinterland. In historical terms, Alexandria's economy in the late Hellenistic period relied on the Nile's grain and on a constellation of maritime trades that spanned the eastern Mediterranean. Storage infrastructure like these terraces would have been essential to smoothing seasonal surpluses and supplying the demands of a dense urban population that swelled with soldiers, administrators, and merchants. Measurements from the site indicate trenches and foundation pads extending more than 200 meters, with individual storage cells whose interior volumes would hold multiples of standard amphora capacities. Soil micromorphology reveals compaction consistent with heavy footfall and cart traffic, and residue analysis, GCMS and lipid signatures, has detected molecular traces consistent with fish oils, salted meat, and possibly certain plant oils used in lamp fuel. Key finds include rectangular stone bins lined with hydraulic mortar, circular mortared vats likely used for brining, and a sequence of post holes that probably supported timber roofing. Intriguingly, several of the storage cells contained foreign ceramics, fine tableware alongside utilitarian courseware, suggesting that the complex handled both low-value bulk commodities and higher-value trade goods. Scholars are divided about the complex's function. Some interpret it as a civic granary and provisioning depot, part of a crown-controlled supply chain designed to stabilize grain supplies and tax incomes. Under this reading, Cleopatra and her administrators would have used such facilities to manage food security and to project state power through provisioning. Another theory reads the terraces as private enterprise, clusters of merchant-owned warehouses operating under lease agreements, perhaps even owned by a merchant class that combined Alexandrian Greeks, Levantine traders, and local Egyptians in joint ventures. Yet a third idea frames the complex as a seasonal processing zone, where fish were salted, textiles were treated, and perishable goods were prepared for long journeys, rather than as a long-term storage facility. Now, let's be fair, the civic granary model is appealing because Alexandria's cosmopolitan population and its fame as an exporter make centralized storage plausible. Historical decrees from other Hellenistic polities show how states attempted to regulate supplies. But this model must reconcile with the chemical evidence pointing strongly to fish processing, which seems oddly specific unless granaries were co-located with other processing industries for logistical reasons. The merchant warehouse theory fits the mix of ceramics, explaining the presence of luxury wares as the product of private trade, but that requires us to accept a fairly high degree of private capital concentration in late Ptolemaic Alexandria, a plausible scenario, but one that complicates narratives that emphasize royal control. But here's where it gets tricky. Our stratigraphic columns reveal episodes of burning and rebuilding in the same footprint, so the terraces may have served multiple functions across centuries. Social history also complicates interpretation. Who staffed these warehouses? Epigraphic fragments show traces of graffiti and numerals scratched into mortar, tallies of quantities perhaps, or the names of overseers, but the sample is too small to reconstruct the labor regime. Local myths amplify the sensory texture of the place. Tales circulate of a night market that used to run along the waterfront, where traders hawked salted goods and strange spices to sailors who sang songs in tongues no one local understood. Some fishermen swear there are places in the silt where you can feel the hollow thump of buried vats if you stomp at low tide. Imagine walking between those terraces in the mist. The smell of brine and fermenting fish, the clatter of jars being hoisted, the torchlight throwing long shadows as laborers move in careful ranks. Imagine the intimate soundscape of commerce. The reflective insight is blunt and human. Infrastructure is mundane, but it is the scaffolding of empire and of daily survival alike. A city's romance depends on its warehouses as much as on its palaces, and yet their stones often go unnoticed beneath our desire for drama. We still don't know whether these terraces were royal granaries, private merchant depots, or seasonal processing yards repurposed across centuries. We still don't know the names and faces of the people whose work kept Alexandria fed and afloat. Further out, where a shallow bar gives way to a clearer blue and the seabed rises into isolated rock knolls, the team found something that pulled together the civic and the sacred, a submerged precinct of what might have been a ritual landing and small temple complex, aligned on an axis that points not inland but to the sea itself, an orientation you don't expect from a straight commercial quay. The one-sentence teaser is irresistible: a sacred harbor precinct, its stepped approach and stone altars facing the water, hints at maritime ritual intimately tied to political display and perhaps to the rights of a queen who made spectacle part of sovereignty. Historically, the Hellenistic rulers of Egypt cultivated religious syncretism. Ptolemaic rulers adopted Egyptian cults and recast themselves in Greek royal modes. So a waterside sanctuary dedicated to a syncretic deity or to the living ruler is entirely plausible. In measurable terms, the precinct stretches approximately 80 meters along an east-west axis, with what looks like a stepped stone approach descending from a raised platform roughly 3 meters above the surrounding seabed. Carved blocks recovered nearby bear traces of tooling consistent with late Hellenistic stonework, their dimensions conforming to the modular masonry practices known from royal projects elsewhere. Among the finds are fragments of limestone reliefs with fluted borders, a small basalt altar base with a shallow bowl carved into it, and votive deposits, clusters of small bowls, beads, and deliberately broken miniature amphorae, placed in what appears to be a structured pattern. Chemical assays of residue from the altar bowls show traces of burned resins and pigments consistent with incense and aromatic oils associated with Mediterranean cult practices. There is also a group of objects that complicates easy identification: a cache of bronze mirrors, several comb fragments made from bone, and a scattering of tiny glass beads whose colors match palettes sourced to Levantine workshops. These personal items, if deliberately deposited, suggest offerings by women, an interpretation that dovetails with historical evidence that women were often principal participants in certain domestic and maritime cults. But that leads to competing theories. One school reads the precinct as a royal ceremonial landing, a place where the monarch's barge would have tied up and where ritual greeting of the deity, or of the people, would take place, a stage for political theater in which Cleopatra's own bark might have been the living centerpiece. Proponents of this theory point to parallels in the Eastern Mediterranean, rulers who staged sea-borne processions to dramatize divine favor and civic legitimacy, and to numismatic imagery that sometimes shows monarchs in maritime contexts. Another interpretation frames the site as primarily a commercial cult, a sanctuary dedicated to a deity of safe passage or to a patron of sailors and merchants, frequented by crews seeking protection for their voyages and leaving small votives in exchange. A third reading, more skeptical, suggests the features are misaligned natural outcrops intensively modified by fishermen and early modern builders who repurposed stones and left ritual objects not because of ancient cult but as improvised talismans from later centuries. Now, let's be fair, the royal landing interpretation has the attractive synergy of politics and piety, implying an intentional intersection where ceremonial and infrastructural needs met, but it rests on associating small finds, beads and mirrors, with elite female presence, which could be challenged as projecting modern gendered categories back onto a more fluid past. The commercial cult view is supported by ethnographic parallels. Harbors often develop small sanctuaries for protection, but has a harder time explaining the scale and apparent stonework ambition of the platform. And the skeptical naturalist reading must account for carved blocks and the pattern deposition of votives, which seem unlikely to be random. But here's where it gets tricky. Coastal sanctuaries are liminal places par excellence, where sea and city touch, and so they collect layers of ritual across centuries. A shrine established in the Hellenistic era could easily have been reused in the Roman, Byzantine, and even Islamic periods, each community depositing its own objects, washing the earlier traces into new contexts. That palimpsest makes it difficult to link any single votive to a single moment. Still, for all the careful stratigraphic work, the precinct is wrapped in myth. Fishermen and old market women speak of a Queen's Step, a set of stones that appear at the lowest tides where a royal bark supposedly once moored. The stones, they say, hum faintly under your feet if you step on them in the dark. There are tales, half-ashamed confessions told over tea, of sailors who found small mirrors in their nets and then dreamt of palaces, or of a girl who swore she could smell myrrh rising from the water every time a storm came. Dive logs preserve more dramatic reports. A carved female head, its nose worn but eyes arresting, was recovered from the precinct and later identified by one scholar as possibly representing a Hellenized Egyptian goddess, perhaps Isis in a maritime guise. Others dispute the identification, insisting it could be an imported figure of Tai Chi or a local syncretic form that resists easy naming. Picture yourself kneeling on that stepped platform as it lies underwater, your gloved hand tracing a worn edge, the light of a diver's lamp scattering across a bowl carved into the altar, and the sensation that the sea has preserved a choreography of encounter, king or queen arriving, priests performing small rites, sailors depositing tiny tokens and whispering their pleas. That invitation to imagine does not replace evidence but helps us feel why people invoke the gods before they brave the open sea. Because ritual is also a technology of uncertainty management. The reflective insight here is that sacred spaces by the water were ways of making the invisible, chance, fate, the fickle blessing of winds, appear bounded and negotiable. In a polity where image and religion were instruments of rule, a maritime sanctuary could be a node where public ritual reinforced political legitimacy, and where the personal anxieties of sailors found expression in material acts. Yet the stubborn line we must close on is plain. We still don't know whether this precinct was a stage for royal theatrics tied to Cleopatra's person, a popular harbor shrine, or an accumulation of ritual practice layered across many centuries. We still don't know. Not far from that precinct, in a muddy inlet where the ocean's mood is more sullen than capricious, geophysics traced a darker anomaly that one of the senior divers called, half-joking, the purple patch. The moniker stuck because of the cluster of finds, fragments of textile dyed with a deep, stubborn purple, the remains of dye kettles, and crushed murex shells. Finally, the chemical signature many had hoped for, a trace of Egyptian purple production that could tie the site directly to one of Alexandria's most famous industries. The one-sentence teaser here is simple and intoxicating. Evidence of purple dye production on a coastal terrace suggests large-scale Tyrian-type industry possibly operating under royal or commercial guild control, and purple, of course, is a color saturated with symbolism in antiquity, royalty, wealth, and sometimes curse. Historically, purple dye, derived from the murex brand Eris and other gastropods, was a luxury commodity traded across the Mediterranean. Control of its production conferred prestige and often involved specialized labor, seasonal exploitation of shellfish beds, and knowledge-intensive processing. Measurably, the dye processing area covers roughly 100 square meters of shallow terrace with rectangular vats cut into bedrock and lined with hydraulic mortar. Fragmentary textile impressions on retracted mortar suggest textiles were worked in situ, and the mass of shell middens nearby, crushed shells compacted to depths of half a meter, indicates sustained, possibly industrial extraction and production. Organic residue analysis, using chromatographic techniques, has detected brominated indigoid compounds consistent with murex purple. Isotopic profiling of the shell material suggests a local provenance, rather than imported shell, which implies a near-shore collection and processing economy. Key discoveries include small ceramic ladles likely used to transfer dye, spindle whorls that suggest on-site textile work rather than mere dyeing, and an intriguing cache of small lead seals bearing iconography that some interpret as guild marks or tax stamps. Competing theories cluster around the scale and control of production. One view, buoyed by the presence of administrative seals, reads the site as a state-run purple house, an industry controlled or heavily taxed by the Ptolemaic crown, which would align with royal appropriation of luxury goods and the use of purple as a visual language of sovereignty. Another psychologist of economies argues for a large, private workshop system, wealthy merchants or Levantine dyers operating a cooperative network, perhaps even producing for export to Roman elites. A third approach suggests a more informal, artisanal mode where households engaged seasonally in murex processing as part of a mixed livelihood portfolio, fishing in some months, dyeing in others, explaining both the industrial residue and the domestic artifacts found nearby. Now, let's be fair. The presence of what might be fiscal seals is tempting evidence of state regulation, but seals can be used by private bodies too. Conversely, the industrial scale implied by shell deposits could still be organized through small-scale but intensive household production aggregated across many families. But here's where it gets tricky. Purple dyework is environmentally messy and labor-intensive, and it leaves a durable archaeological signature precisely because of the shell middens. The problem is that coastal change can disrupt these middens, mixing them with later debris and making temporal attributions slippery. Add to that the human tendency to mythologize purple. Local tales assert that purple is cursed, that anyone who steals it meets misfortune, and that a queen's purple, produced here, marked royal cloth. Divers tell of odd finds, a set of tiny glass vials containing a residue that smelled faintly of brine and iron, interpreted by some as perfume vials for luxury textiles, and by others as later pilgrim souvenirs. Picture yourself wading into that dying terrace at low tide, the smell of fermenting shell and algae, the roughness of crushed shells underfoot, and the kaleidoscopic idea that this grimy, pungent spot produced the color that became the emblem of imperial power. That imaginative leap helps us understand how material processes, digging shells, stirring vats, pounding textiles, translate into symbolic authority. The reflective insight is stark. The labor that produced signs of power is often degraded, polluting, and hidden in middens. Empire rests on many hands that seldom appear in the monuments. And yet, despite the chemical signatures and the scale of shell deposits, we still don't know whether this purple patch was a royal monopoly, a merchant enterprise, or the aggregated work of many households. We still don't know. If you look back over the fragments we've walked through, the drowned quay with its hulking masonry, the ship's cemetery where ribs lie like the articulations of a lost language, the warehouse terraces that hum with the echo of bulk commerce, the steppe precinct where ritual met sea, and the purple-stained terraces where shells were pulverized into the pigment of power, you begin to see not a single tidy narrative but a braided story of human intention, environmental caprice, and historical accident. That braided story resists simple headlines because it insists on being both infrastructural and intimate. Quays and vats tell us about logistics and statecraft, while a bronze fibula, a child's cup, or a shard of fine tableware insist on the everydayness of people who loved, feared, traded, argued, and prayed. The archaeological record is generous in things and miserly in names. We recover amphorae and anchors more readily than diaries and petitions. So the deepest payoff of what we've assembled is not a final proof that this or that stone was laid by Cleopatra's own hand, but the fuller sense we gain of how power was lived and made possible. By boats and docks, by salt and dye, by the debris of daily life and the stage theater of procession. We have repeatedly balanced competing hypotheses because that is the honest shape of the evidence. Some features, architectural proportions, certain masonry tooling patterns, clusters of Ptolemaic coinage, lean toward a late Hellenistic attribution, the time when Cleopatra's rules shaped Alexandria's political rhythms. Other elements, reused blocks, mixed ceramic assemblages, and later stratigraphic intrusions, argue for complex palimpsests where Roman, Byzantine, or even medieval actors retooled older structures. Natural forces complicate everything. Estuarine currents rearrange artifacts, earthquakes topple columns into the mud, and rising and falling sea levels bury entire neighborhoods in silt. Layering on top of these physical processes are the human ones: reclamation, reuse, scavenging, which mean that what we see is the residue of many episodes of construction and destruction. That is, at once, a frustrating constraint and a rich opportunity. Messy sites force us to be more inventive and more careful in our reading, to triangulate between material science, radiocarbon, isotopes, residue analysis, architectural comparison, textual sources, and local oral history. Each line of evidence is partial. Together they can carve a narrative that is provisional but compelling. The provisional stories we can tell are powerful because they relocate agency. Too often, grand histories reduce places like Alexandria to the deeds of rulers and generals. The queen's portrait on a coin, the ambassadorial drama with Rome, the imperial writ. Those narratives have their place. But when we look at a quay or a brine vat, our attention turns to the craftsman, The boatmen, the dyers, the dockmasters, the children playing on the shore, people who usually vanish from high politics. The purple terraces, for instance, do not just speak of imperial symbolism. They speak of hands that scraped shell and stirred vats until the air smelled of iron and brine, of families whose seasonal labor produced currency of a social color. The ship cemetery is not merely a catalogue of losses in a naval campaign. It is a record of the fragile economies that sustained long-distance exchange, fleets of merchantmen that were both lifelines and liabilities. The warehouse terraces show us the banal scaffolding of empire, storage, measurement, the bureaucratic impulse to count and control, and the way such infrastructures fold into taxation, food security, and civic ritual. When we see the cramped votive deposits in the steppe sanctuary, we glimpse the private anxieties that public rights tried to soothe, the small business owner who wanted fair passage, the mother who wanted her son returned from a voyage, the queen who modeled herself in the trappings of a deity to make rule legible to an often divided populace. Yet myth persists and matters because myth is one of the social ways these communities handled loss and meaning. Tales of cursed stones, of tiny mirrors that bring visions of palaces, of giant bones snagged on nets. These are not merely comic diversions for the tourist trade. They are historical artifacts in their own right. They tell us how memory works at the interface of material absence and human storytelling. When a fisherman says that a net snagged on a giant bone, that testimony is an event in the history of interpretation. What one man calls a curiosity, another will call a relic, and a third will assign to it a moral lesson about greed or fate. Divers' reports of an apotropaic statue or the recovered carved head are catalogued alongside chemical assays and sonar lines, because the human response to the sea's appetite for human structures is part of the archive. We can be skeptical of sensational claims. There are rarely literal giants. But we can also learn from the social imagination that surrounds such claims. Sometimes myth points us toward real but misrecognized phenomena. Sometimes it illuminates cultural anxieties that run deep and enduring. What does any of this mean for Cleopatra? If anything, the queen's name is a gravitational center around which modern attention circles, and that attention can be both clarifying and distorting. Claiming to have found Cleopatra's harbor can draw funding and public interest, but it can also compress centuries into a single symbol. The more cautious and, I think, productive move is to see Cleopatra as a plausible, potent node in the story of a coastal system that she certainly influenced, and which in turn shaped the levers of her power. Her policies, her diplomatic maritime strategies, and her public performances would have been embedded in the very infrastructures we're studying. A royal fleet needs slips and keys. A queen who negotiated grain shipments needed warehouses and provisioning systems. A ruler who used spectacle would have exploited sanctuaries and processional landings. But we should not reduce these structures to mere backdrops for her biography. They were actively constitutive of political life. Excavating them helps us recenter the material conditions of sovereignty, ways of organizing labor, moving goods, and staging legitimacy that were often invisible to the chroniclers who wrote about battles and alliances. There is an ethical dimension to this work we cannot neglect. These underwater sites are part of a living cultural landscape. Fishermen still ply these waters, families live on the Corniche, and local traditions fold around these submerged histories. Archaeology must therefore be collaborative, not extractive. Scientists should work with local communities, share finds and interpretations, and support stewardship that benefits those who live with these legacies. Looting and careless recovery destroy most of the contextual information that makes artifacts meaningful. Conversely, inclusive practices can turn archaeology into a resource for education, heritage, and local identity, without romanticizing the past or sacrificing rigorous science. In our case, the voices of local fishermen, the stories of market women, and the memories of divers have already shaped hypotheses and in some cases led to finds. The sea does not yield its past to outsiders alone, and any claim about discovery must acknowledge that these seas have always been shared. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a reshaped appreciation for complexity, a richer sense of the kinds of questions we should ask, and a stubborn list of unresolved puzzles to occupy our curiosity. We can say with reasonable confidence that the area offshore Alexandria preserves a network of maritime features, quays, warehouses, processing terraces, sanctuaries, and ship losses that were active in the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods and that intersected with the political economy in which Cleopatra moved. We can also say that these features are palimpsests, reused, rebuilt, and overwritten across centuries by nature and by people. We can further assert that the most compelling narratives are the ones that both honor the Queen's probable relevance and refuse to let her name eclipse the many unnamed actors whose labor and devotion created the harbor's life. And finally, we can affirm that the human resonance of these finds, the shards, the oil, the mirror fragments, matters as much as any architectural plan because it restores faces to an otherwise schematic past. In that sense, our conclusion is as much moral as it is archaeological. The sea's remnants teach us humility. They invite us to stand at the water's edge and contemplate contingency, how fragile systems of supply and authority are, how easily cities can be remade by natural forces, and how stories accumulate in layers, each generation rewriting what came before. There is also wonder, that shiver when a diver brings up an amphora after 2,000 years, or when a chemical assay finally confirms a trace of purple that once signified rulership. Those moments are what make the slow work worth it, the patience of coring and careful recording rewarded by a new connection to human lives long past. As with any good archaeological story, ours ends not with answers sealed shut but with open tracks forward, more coring, more careful conservation, interdisciplinary studies that borrow from geology and chemistry and from historians who can read both texts and the silences between them. There are also ethical imperatives. To work with local communities, to publish findings in accessible forms, and to protect these submerged places from destructive commercial salvage. And there is, humbly, an invitation to you, the viewer, the listener, the curious reader, to imagine yourself in the tiny, capacious moments that make history, a dyer lifting a cloth from a vat, the creak of a ship's tiller, a woman slipping a mirror into a bowl as an offering, a child dropping a gaming piece into silt that will forget it for 2 millennia. That is the human heart of archaeology, the conviction that objects speak if we know how to listen, and that listening reshapes how we understand power, labor, art, and belonging. We will keep returning to the data and to the stories, refining dates, testing hypotheses, and inviting new voices into the conversation. For now, however, the most honest sentence to leave you with is not a declaration of triumph but an open, insistent call: keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.